and welcome to Newsroom's latest episode of Raw Politics. I'm Jo Moir and I have with me Sam Sachdeva. Hello, Sam.
Hello.
And in Auckland we have Tim Murphy. Hello, Tim.
Hi, guys.
This week we're chatting about the sorry saga that is Michael Wood's now $16,000 of shares that he has just got rid of. And we're also going to dive into proposed changes to the electoral system. To wrap things up, as always, we will offer a recommendation for something that you all might like to read, listen or watch. Now, before we get into anything, some declarations of our own. Any conflicts of interest, guys? Shares in Auckland Airport. Lay it all out on the table.
I did check my KiwiSaver this morning just to be sure, and there is some shares of that in Auckland Airport, so I'm not going to take part in this podcast just to be safe. I'll leave it to you two to handle.
And I, Joe, I have some shares in Newsroom New Zealand Limited, so it's a conflict for me because I need you guys to perform well here on this podcast.
Oh, good to know that I'm the only one not conflicted here today. That's a change. Well, look, you're both sticking around because I'm not doing this by myself, so we'll just get on with it, should we? I'll start with you, Sam. I mean, what an absolute sloppy shambles this whole thing has been with Michael Wood. Can you just give us a quick, I guess, rundown, succinct summary of what on earth has happened?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still vaguely perplexed by it all, to be honest. We had the start of this week, I think, a story from Thomas Coughlan in the New Zealand Herald talking about the fact that Michael Wood had these shares in Auckland Airport that had not been disclosed. We had the Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, quizzed about it at his post-cabinet press conference. He said, he's probably been told, Michael Wood's been told about half a dozen times to get rid of them. The next day we find out, actually, just a little bit more than 6 times. It's 12, twice as much. So
12. Just to remind everyone, 12 times.
12 times. And it was pretty excruciating having the Prime Minister read out each of the dates in question time. So it's just the repeated reminders to do something. He just hasn't done it. And the thing that confuses me is there's no obvious motive. I don't think this is corrupt intent. Maybe I'm being too naive, but there's no, we're talking about a pretty small amount of money and a pretty small amount of capital gain by virtue of holding on to them. So it just doesn't make sense that he would not do anything. Maybe you do have to take him at his word that it's forgetfulness, but also you've got a whole bunch of private secretaries around you, a press secretary. You've got a big office of people who can presumably help to move you along. So I'm just confused, really. And enlighten me, Tim. Can you make sense of this?
Well, I think there's a third option. I don't think there's anything corrupt either, but I don't actually think it's just being busy and forgetful. I think there's a third option, which is in the middle of those two things, which is for people like him who believe they're just a bit too important to deal with these sorts of things. That I'm not just a busy person, but I'm a busy person with very important things to do. And, these sorts of things are just trivial, that trivial people are bothering me with. And that's sort of an attitude that can creep in to people in positions like this. Obviously there's no gain to him. The numbers are small. And it's embarrassed and put political problems for his wife, Auckland councillor, inconveniently, looking at the Auckland Airport shares sale at the same time. So I don't think there's any sort of, grand intent other than a possible superiority complex.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about this too is whether it's going to start to become a bit of a Stuart Nash situation. And I think we're starting to see some change in language with Chris Hipkins as well. He's been very careful not to sort of say, oh, well, yes, he will definitely be back as a minister, or yes, he will, keep this portfolio or that portfolio. A very, very awkward press conference from Chris Hipkins on the bridge this week when he was asked whether Michael Wood would still be a minister at the election. And there was this painful, awkward silence and the usual sort of which Chris Hipkins is very good at doing when he has no idea what the hell the answer is to the question, before he sort of answered a completely different question and said that he still has trust and confidence in Michael Wood. So I'm just waiting to see whether there is kind of another step in the saga, because this is what happened with Stuart Nash, right, is the story kept changing, and that's when it became that cumulative effect, and you ended up having Chris Hipkins, belatedly, I would argue, have to deal with it way further down the track because it just carried on and on and on. Now, I would hope that sort of this airport shares situation that Michael Wood's got himself in is a fairly sort of open and shut case. I mean, he's got rid of the shares now, $16,000 they were up to, and he's donated them to a charity, we've heard. So you would expect that that's kind of the end of it. But then you only have to look at the fact that, Jonathan Milne, our own newsroom pro editor this morning, sort of added another leg to the story, and that he had specifically asked Michael Wood whether he had any sort of shares, interests, anything pecuniary that needed to be declared that hadn't been 2 years ago, and his office replied and specifically said no. Now, they replied and said no a couple of days after the Cabinet Office had just reminded Michael Wood for about the third time that he needed to sell these shares. So this is getting a little bit problematic, and Chris Hipkins will be sitting up on the 9th floor going, when the hell is this going to end, and how much longer am I going to have to deal with this for?
Yeah. Do you think it's a resignation offence? Based on what we know at the moment. I'm really conflicted on it myself. I don't know if you have views, Tim or Joe.
I don't, and I didn't initially. I just think it says a bit about character to me, and also a lack of protection for his Prime Minister in the last few days that is sort of internally worrying to them. I don't know that it affects your ability to be a minister, but from their party and their government, especially a new leader trying to get going and get 4 more months to an election, to have someone who's one of the trusted ones to show so little kind of precision and care in the last few days even, and not to have been able to get completely on top of everything immediately that the 12th time it came up, or the 13th time was when the Herald made inquiries, right? So you got to give that to the media, the Herald, the reason we know about this. I think it's character. That's what concerns me, but it's more an internal thing for Hipkins, I think, than for the ministry.
Well, and this is just another week where Chris Hipkins is not talking about your beloved bread and butter, Sam. He's had plenty of weeks. He's had Jan Tinetti weeks. He's had Mika Whaitiri weeks. He's had Kitty Allen weeks. There's one other in there, can't remember who.
Forget.
Stuart Nash.
Overwhelming.
We've already covered it, Stuart Nash weeks. And now we're on to Michael Wood week. Is it going to be weeks plural? Like, who knows? He's got an issue, needs to be dealt with. Otherwise, I mean, we could still be talking about this and, next time the House is back. We've got recess next week. But are we going to have another situation where we're going to cycle through all of this again through another sitting week?
After Kelvin Davis's performance in the House on Thursday, standing in for Hipkins, answering questions about Michael Wood, you'd have to wonder whether there's another minister there who's not up to the task as well. I'd have to say I thought it was a terrible, terrible attempt to front up, and very unfortunate that he had to do it.
Does this say anything about the Prime Minister himself, that we've had this run of incidents? I know Jacinda Ardern had a few in her time, and certainly with Michael Wood, this was an ongoing problem while she was Prime Minister. It just didn't get picked up until now. But, I've seen some suggestions that Chris Hipkins has a slightly less controlling style with his cabinet ministers. Do they feel a bit freer to do things? Or is it just bad luck, I guess, that this has all kind of landed on his desk in the last few months?
Well, Sam, I think it does a bit because, and it also now, I think, from what we've learned in Parliament Thursday afternoon, seems to be that Jacinda Ardern's administration, i.e. her Chief of Staff, were also notified and involved. So it's not just Hipkins either. It goes back wider to the management of these things and to the responsibility the ministers feel. As an aside, Joe, I think Chris Hipkins has got to get trained out of that possum in the headlights, gulpingly hesitant silences that he's done now 3 or 4 times at proper stand-ups and press conferences.
Will Michael Wood still be a minister come the election?
I have trust and confidence in Michael.
Everyone assumed he was the sort of agile, erudite kind of political professional, but he's shown that fault a few times as well. But yeah, sorry, Joe, what do you make of whether it's him who's at fault?
Look, Tim, I think that Chris Hipkins has got to get the ship kind of sorted a little bit here, and he did put out a memo after the Stuart Nash stuff to all of his ministers and MPs to say, cross your T's, dot your I's, all of that stuff. Now, Michael Wood has said to the media this week that he got that message. He just didn't listen to it. So that's unfortunate. But, Chris Hipkins is going to have to be on top of these things a little bit more if he's got ministers who just aren't kind of getting the message even when it's being sent out. But also, Michael Wood shouldn't be needing a reminder like that. Michael Wood has been around long enough and is competent enough and is, a safe pair of hands enough to know what he should and shouldn't be doing. Now, most people don't get the luxury of getting told 12 times to do it. So how on earth he's ended up in this situation is absolutely beyond me. And this is the thing is, the question keeps on getting asked of Michael Wood. This is perplexing. This is confusing. How has this happened? And, speaking of possum and headlights, you've sort of got Michael Wood kind of staring at you going, he just doesn't have an answer. He just sort of doesn't seem to know. And I just find that really odd from someone, who appears to be pretty switched on, has been given these big portfolios because he can be trusted, can deal with, difficult situations and has not kind of got himself in any particular really bad, sticky situations in the past. He's occasionally been, the odd one with the immigration portfolio and whatnot, but then who doesn't have a bit of a sticky situation with the immigration portfolio every now and again? But, for the most part, he's got his head screwed on. And it's just like, how on earth has your head been so not screwed on for this period of time where you've literally had someone telling you, sort it out, times 12?
Well, it's interesting to me that Michael Wood, but also Kerry Allen, both were names that were kicked around, Michael's more sensibly than Kerry's, at the time of the changeover from Ardern to Hipkins. There was a sort of vague talk of who the contenders might be. Because I think both were sort of faultless to that point, if you like, their performance and their effectiveness. When I heard of Woods' dilemma, it just took me back to Steve Mahari in Clark's government. He got in some trouble that I can't even remember what it was, but it came out during that one of his responses was he took umbrage at the criticism of him because, quotes, "I've lived a life of blameless excellence to this point." And I thought that would be Michael thinking that. Here I am, I've done everything right at every point. But because I just didn't look after these minor things, I'm in the,
I might steal that line and put it on my gravestone. Sam Sachdeva lived a life of blameless excellence. Got a nice ring to it.
I also want to ask, just because this is a bit of a segue, but it has come up as part of this issue. When you talk about conflicts of interest and what people should be disclosing and shouldn't be disclosing, there's been a lot of rhetoric around about, the number of houses that MPs own and what that might have an impact on in terms of decisions that they might be making around rental controls or, that sort of stuff, home ownership stuff. So I'm just interested in your guys' thoughts as to, New Zealand's a small country, and I know we've talked about this before, Tim, and you've always said that, conflicts are impossible in a country like New Zealand, but impossible to avoid. But is there an argument to be made that, people who own multiple houses should actually be recusing themselves from those sorts of conversations?
I don't think so, because I think the pecuniary interest register serves that purpose. So long as it's known, then I think that context, so we all know that if Chris Luxon is taking a stance on rental properties in East Auckland, then you get a much clearer view because he's got 9 or 12 or 27 or whatever it is. And similarly with the farmers, with all their holdings, and with people who have, one of the MPs in that recent register that came out had two and a half pages of companies that he was invested in. It was astonishing. Now, it might be funds, but the managed funds ones don't do that. So, what representative function can you perform if you're ruled out on all those kind of, basic interests? So long as we know, then there's a starting point.
Yeah, you can't have too many. It would end up like real politics and none of us would be allowed to be here. The electoral review that's proposed everything from a referendum on whether we should have 4-year terms to a $30,000 cap on donations. Seems like a good place to start with donations, Sam. So $30,000 cap, but probably the more sort of interesting part of that is actually the fact that it would also, if you went with the recommendation from the electoral review, would be that it would only be individuals, right? So you wouldn't have things like corporates, unions, for example, who obviously do regularly donate at the moment, being able to donate. And I thought Andrew Geddes made a really good point about this actually on Morning Report this week, where he said, well, elections are the people who vote for elections and go along to the polling booth are individuals. So and that's what democracy is. So if it's individuals who get to have a vote, well then they should be the only ones who get to throw some money at the parties as well. Thoughts?
Yeah, look, it's really, really interesting, and it would be a huge shift. Mark Dalder, our esteemed gallery colleague, ran the numbers, and you would go, okay, National Party, big money, act big money, they'll be hit. But actually, in terms of dollar figures, raw dollars, it would have been the Labour Party at the last election which lost the most money, and the Māori Party, Te Pāti Māori, that lost the greatest percentage of their donations. Labour obviously gets quite a lot from unions that support them, and larger donations from individuals. And Te Pāti Māori, I think, had a lot that came through John Tamahere and trusts in different forms. So there are caveats that we don't have full information for numbers under $15,000 in terms of who those have come from. But it would be a huge shift in our system, and I think it's quite telling that the Green Party, we can probably get to them, but I think most of the parties have been lukewarm at best on that suggestion, even the Labour Party, which, commissioned this review. So it could be transformative, but whether it's going to happen or not, I don't know, because it would just be such a big difference for us. And then there's a matter of state funding, and I don't know what you think about the prospects of any change in that space, Tim, because it's something that's been mooted in the past, not very popular with the public, but you've had this review panel suggest a modest increase to state funding to kind of compensate for this new cap that would be in place on donations.
Yeah, I think they're quite an idealistic and probably fair group. What they've seen and come up with, it's what people who understand and are involved in these things are thinking is the best way forward. I think some increased state funding is probably sensible. We're very tolerant of it for the broadcast funding and for parliamentary party funding between elections. There's quite a lot of money goes into all the MPs and their publicity of their activities as MPs. So I think there's probably a element you could put up there in state funding. The limits, I'm tempted towards the limiting it to individuals as well. I think all the problems we've had in the various serious fraud and other inquiries and cases into these things are over entities and organisations, really, and going into entities and organisations rather than direct to parties as well. I think there's real room just to clear it up. It's been staggering on for years, which is not to say that parties seeking 4 months out from an election to bring money in as fast as possible will want to be talking about any of this right now.
What about the expanding voting rights? Because the review suggested, expanding to 16 and 17-year-olds and also going further with the changes that I think Andrew Littlemade did, and he as Justice Minister for prisoners, to extend it to all prisoners. Bear in mind, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but we have had a Supreme Court ruling, haven't we, that 16 and 17-year-olds should have the right to vote. And I guess it's fair to say that if you've got the other end of the age spectrum being allowed to vote, well, what's to say you don't have 16 and 17-year-olds when, you're allowed to legally buy a gun, get married? There's a few things that you can do by that age anyway. What do you think the chances are? I mean, Parliament's not really looking as if they're particularly into that idea, are they?
No, it's slim to none. I mean, Chris Hipkins is quite clear that there's not a super majority there, because it would take 75% of Parliament to vote in favour of changing that, given it's an entrenched provision. You could make the case of going to the electorate and having a referendum, but then you have this perverse thing where the people whose rights are being affected have no ability to vote in that referendum because they can't vote. So it gets a little bit circular. So I don't know what happens there. I mean, the Supreme Court has said it's inconsistent with the Bill of Rights Act. Parliament doesn't need to do anything, but that's just going to be sitting there awkwardly and hanging over them, that there's this right that's being deprived. A certain group of New Zealanders being deprived of a right that the Supreme Court, our judicial system, believes they should have.
Speaking of a referendum, Tim, are you a 3-year term or a 4-year term man?
I've always been a 4-year term man. I voted 4 years in 1990. That referendum got absolutely thrown out of, totally out of the consideration, because people had just gone through the Rogernomics revolution. They'd gone through the Labour government imploding, the infighting, the executive just driving stuff through despite Geoffrey Palmer's great intent and principles, and changing the country beyond recognition almost economically and socially and in a whole lot of other ways. So it came to a chance to vote on should we give these guys more time to do these things or not. And it got absolutely minced. It was the wrong context and time for it, unfortunately. But I totally think we need more time between politicking and campaigning to get on with governing and to get things moving. And sensible countries have it. We should.
I am very pro 4 years, Sam.
Yeah, I am as well, but I don't know that it's an argument the general public will get behind. And I know what you're talking about, Tim, in terms of bad timing back then, but even now, I can see it being a tough case. It's sort of, turkeys voting for Christmas or the other way around. I can never remember how that goes. But I guess the issue I have here, a broader issue, is a lot of these recommendations are not new. That the MMP party vote threshold needs to be reduced, that we need to get rid of the coattailing rule. This idea of a 4-year term, I think, has come up in the past, has come up in the past. So we have these things that go around and round. You have these relatively expensive reviews that are conducted, and then Parliament does nothing about it. And I don't know that there's a easy solution to that, because you don't want governments of the day to be ramming through significant electoral changes without a broad consensus. But if we're going to commission this work and then it just ends up going nowhere, I don't really know what the point is. It's sort of frustrating in that regard. Either leave it and accept our system as it is, imperfect or otherwise, or find a way to build a consensus for this.
It was frustrating, actually, after the review came out on, what was that, Tuesday morning, I think. And then we had caucus run, and, I threw that list of things that we've just discussed at Chris Luxon to ask him for his response in terms of where National sits on all of those things. And he turned around and he said, oh, well, that's not what New Zealanders care about, and they want to be talking about the cost of living crisis and law and order and all this sort of stuff. And, I get that, trying to stay on message and all of that, but, I'm pretty sure New Zealanders can do two things at the same time, and they can care about, the big issues, and they can also have a think about, what the electoral law looks like in New Zealand and what the election process looks like. And I thought it was a little bit sort of, I don't know what he was trying to be, really. He eventually got there when I made the point that, you'll talk about this another month, just not today. But, to sort of say, oh, well, this is something that we shouldn't be talking about at all is just a little bit ridiculous, because actually you're not going to have reform or transformation or make progress on anything if you just decide that in whatever month of whatever year there's only a couple of things you're allowed to talk about.
In June, we talk about road signs being in Te Reo.
Our newsroom audience question today is, how problematic is it for New Zealand First and National to have donation cases back in court in August and September, just ahead of the October election? Tim, I feel like this is your wheelhouse.
Well, having spent endless weeks on both these cases last year, I think we all thought it was behind us. But the person who would have hoped it was entirely behind them and not coming up again now would be Winston Peters in New Zealand First. And I say Winston more than the National Party because 3 years ago, when the Serious Fraud Office decided they were going to prosecute these two anonymous name-suppressed people over New Zealand First Foundation donations, they did it in September, just before the election. Peters went to court to try and stop them doing that then, failed, said it was basically jackboot behaviour by the Serious Fraud Office and maligning and unfairly treating his party. Here we are, 3 years on, and an appeal by the Serious Fraud Office against the two people having been freed or acquitted of those charges is to be heard in September. So it's just very poor timing. It's not a conspiracy of the state. It's the court system winding its way through. But so some of the details we had then will be argued again in September. And those details weren't flattering for New Zealand First at all. They involved lots of internal squabbles and lots of actions by rich listers, racing folk and fishing industry people and just people like the richest man in the country. So there's lots of details there to be unfortunate. National, it's a month earlier. This time it's the people who were convicted, the donors to National who were convicted, trying to overturn their convictions, and their view is that was unfair against them. But again, it involves the details of what they did, what National did, how the money came in secretly, and it's all washing up, bringing back memories of Jamie Lee Ross and all those long ago problems that our donation systems never got rid of, truly.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you've watched, read or listened to this week that you've enjoyed. Tim, we'll start with you.
Well, mine's not politics, I'll say that. It's media, though, so we'd take that chance on this show to be able to mix our interests. Not declaring a conflict here because it's in America. This is CNN, and its chief executive and chair has stepped aside after a long-running meltdown, basically, of his leadership after a year in charge. But the person and the material I want to put forward for people to have a look at is Oliver Darcy, a CNN journalist who writes on media, who has been charting this guy, his own chief executive's demise, in great detail, hugely bravely, very directly, and was brought in by the CEO the day after their Trump town hall because of how direct and how critical he was of him. But he stuck with it right to the end, and the CEO has now departed. The media journalist is still in place.
You've inspired us, Tim.
Don't criticise your bosses.
And what about you, Sam?
I am recommending Duncan Greaves' piece on the spin-off about the COVID Service Awards and the rigmarole that's turned into. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern had announced that these would be given out to sort of members of the community who were involved in the COVID response in various areas, but there have been a lot of people who seem to have been left out on questionable grounds. So I think it was quite valuable in shining a spotlight on these very valued members of our health sector and other parts of the response who have been overlooked.
Well, I'm going to do the opposite of your recommendation, Tim, and actually promote your work as our boss. So my recommendation this week is Tim Murphy's piece on Newsroom, which was called Roger, Ruth, Wayne and Tina. And Tim does extraordinary stuff on Auckland Council. His reads are always good in that space. But this is a really interesting one about the council budget and Wayne Brown's Tina moment, which is there is no alternative, which is his suggestion around the airport stuff at the moment. So go check that out as well. That's it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our producers, Hugo Stewart and Mark Jennings, our readers, listeners and watchers. Thank you, Sam and Tim, as always.
Cheers.
Pleasure.
You can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.